Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you and good afternoon. Lovely to see the names clocking up in the list. Some familiar faces. It's wonderful to have everybody here this afternoon. I think this is the fourth in our series of talks given by contributors to the 7th edition of Democratic Marxism series. Tonight promises to be a very interesting discussion. The topic is Our Existence is Resistance: Women Challenging Mining and the Climate Crisis in the Time of COVID-19. So we're very happy to be joined this evening by Dineo, Skosana and Jacklyn. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Dineo, who will be starting. Dineo is a senior researcher and coordinator of the Coal Project at the Society, Work and Politics Institute, where Jacklyn also works. Dineo, go ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stacey. I hope you can all hear me. I just thought maybe I'll start off by just giving you a little bit of a background to this paper. In 2018-19 and right through to the beginning of COVID, the Nature and Society cluster at SWAP found the Coal Project, which was coordinated by Jackie, whom I've since taken over from. And so the Coal Project aims to investigate South Africa's transition from coal mining and coal burning to green energy. And in the project, we cover different themes such as dispossession, and that's where my area of focus actually is in. We also look at the resistance thereof, so the resistance of dispossession. So this is the resistance against extractivism. We also look at the exclusion of communities and workers from the framing and the execution of the just transition. And we worked and we still work in the Mpumalanga Highveld as well as Somkhele in KZN. And so as we worked in the project, we were hit by COVID, and we still focused on the same set of issues around dispossession, resistance, and the transition as well, but now in the context of a pandemic. And we sought to investigate women's struggles and resistance in the Highveld, in Mpumalanga, and in Somkhele, in KwaZulu-Natal. And our rationale was that climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic are experienced more intensely by the poor and the marginalized African women specifically. And they experience what in the paper we frame as slow violence. And this is Rob Nixon's idea, which is that this is the kind of violence that is invincible, that is not easy to recognize. And they experience this on a daily. But I think it was exacerbated, particularly during COVID. And so we suggest that given women's role in social reproduction, African women carry the burden of the two interlinked crises. So that is the crisis of climate change, as well as the crisis of COVID. And as Jackie, has continuously argued in her previous work, that women are the shock others of the crisis. And so their resistance to both the climate change crisis as well as COVID-19, we have argued in the paper that promotes the narrative of ecofeminism, or describes even practices of ecofeminism. But what is noteworthy is that the women that we cite, so we've worked with different women organizations, and did not label themselves as feminists or ecofeminists. And so neither do we label them really as that. And I just wanted to read you a quote from our paper, which is from Makoma Lekalakala, which many of you would know, who works for Athla. And she said she warned against imposing any ideological labels, such as feminist or activist, because they undermine solidarity and an ideological consensus. Is not necessary. So basically, I think trying to speak against the using of labels that we sometimes, I think, do when we speak about the communities which we work in. So in the paper, we point that their practice and commitment resemble ecofeminist practices. In other words, Black working class women in mining affected communities are doing important ecofeminist work in their practices rather than in their identity. So they don't claim that they're feminist, but we've argued that they seem to practice what we identify as ecofeminism almost on a daily. So then in the book, we then go on to delve into the idea of women as the shock absorbers. So we try to unpack what does that mean. And I think this work JQ really had done previously and had been consistent in making or submitting that argument. So we described the multiple responsibilities that women undertook during COVID, most of which was intensified, but obviously continuous, such as fetching water, woods, collecting food parcels, and doing care work. And these are tasks of social reproduction. And in Somkele, some women who had been arrested in 2018, and we refer to this case in Somkele for protesting against Tendele's bulk use of water and the lack of water in the communities. They took to the streets once more during COVID and were arrested again. And we also speak about cases of a little bit sort of refer to cases which were reported to us by activists, but I think which were also widespread in the media, which were cases of gender-based violence. So we saw quite an increased, I think, report of that, of gender-based violence at that time. And so we say that being shock absorbers extends into the daily life of the communities that we work with, who experience dispossession, who experience the loss of land-based livelihoods, and who constantly experience extractivism. And so we see how they become shock absorbers in that regard. So then we see women in these spaces as engaged in different forms of resistance. And this is collective action, if you like. And we say that they are confronting the lack of access to clean air, water, or the material conditions which are necessary for social reproduction. And so in Somkele, for instance, we worked with one organization. We've worked with multiple organizations, but I remember this specific one, which was not so organized, which is called Tandoletu. And when we spoke to some of the women who were responsible for establishing this organization, they explained, they said, the organization was formed as we were attending meetings as mine-affected communities. We realized that the mines have specific effects on women. Being part of the organization has changed our lives because whatever we harvest, we share. and we sell our vegetables. We can feed our children and pay for their transport. And so basically really describing how they live on a daily, which is in practicing the idea of, collective sharing and collective resistance against activism. And so they're able to resist by forming or becoming part of women-centered environmental justice organizations. And as I've said, some of these are formal and some of these are not. And so then in their organizations, and I think we show this in the paper, that one of the reasons we frame this as ecofeminism or them practicing ecofeminism is because in their respective organizations, they are thinking about alternatives to capitalism, and they're thinking about not using as storage, but rather thinking about how they could use the environment much more sustainably, but also collectively. And so in this way, liberals allow Jackie maybe to then speak about the methods that we used and highlight some of the arguments spoken about. Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you so much, Dineo. Okay, so it sounds like it's very much a continuity. So we'll take a break after Jackie's had a chance to explain some more detail about the chapter. So yeah, I mentioned that Jackie is also based at what they abbreviate as SWAP, the Society, Work and Politics Institute. And yeah, she's an emeritus professor of sociology at Wits University. And an associate at SWAP. Jackie, please go ahead.
Good. Well, thanks very much, Stacey and Charles and Vish, because I want to start by emphasizing the importance of this occasion. Some of you might have seen the headline in the Sunday Times last week, where it says, Matash, our Minister of Minerals and Energy, is ready for a fight. And he actually says that we have long allowed environmental groups to block development. So that's a gross, unjust and untrue allegation, but it's the time for everyone committed to environmental justice to mobilize against a very, very serious environmental issue, namely the use of coal power ships to generate electricity. It's a very, very serious threat to our oceans. That's the first point. The second point I wanted to make is that as we speak, the bulldozers are in Tendeli, as Dineo mentioned, and they are bulldozing areas of land near Matuba community land that they are going to use to extend their asbestos mine. So there's going to be increasing hardship and dispossession. And I think those 2 points, the one being a very general one, and the other about the specifics of what's happening in mining affected communities, I think underlines the importance of our struggle. And the third point I wanted to make of a general kind is that the notion of a just transition, which was first imported into South Africa by Kasatu, was a transformative notion. It involved large-scale transformative change to create a more just and equal society. It was a radical idea, a revolutionary idea. And what has happened since then is that the notion of a just transition has been appropriated by elite groups and narrowed to mean simply a new energy regime. And very little attention is being given to the question of justice, especially its transformative nature in terms of the redistribution of both power and resources. Those are general points. I want to speak very briefly about 2 things. Firstly, our research approach, and secondly, our theoretical approach. And then I think the interesting thing will be to open up to discussion. Now, in terms of our research strategy, we were skeptical about the individualizing impact of neoliberalism. Neoliberal capitalism is penetrating every aspect of our lives, and it includes the way we do research. And the political thinker Mazibuku Jara has made a very strong argument that individual interviews can be simply extractivism. Well, extractive in that they just extract information and there's no attempt at empowering the informants. Now, I think that's quite common in the social sciences, but then, of course, we have my colleague and friend, Dineo, is a very skilled researcher, and she manages to convey her compassion and empathy with her informants. So I certainly, she has done wonderfully rich work, which you can read about in the forthcoming book, and nothing there, well, that gave people opportunity to reflect and learn about their condition, and especially about the importance of organization. But we attempted to adopt the feminist emphasis on reflexivity and dialogic learning and sharing by using what we called exchange workshops. And we had many of these workshops in the two mining areas of KwaZulu-Natal and Mpumalanga that Dineo mentioned. Oh, and by the way, I should say that a very important participant in these workshops was our third comrade, namely Victor Munich, who made an important contribution to establishing a dynamic place of interaction. What we did was invite members of the community to come to a workshop, which included a substantial lunch. And it's possible that people came originally for the food, but hopefully they found the workshop interesting. And so they stayed for a day. And what we did was to divide the community members into small groups, and we asked them to confront and think about two questions. And the first question was, what is it like living in a mining affected community? And the second question was, what would you most like to change? And we maintain in our chapter or the paper that this was empowering because it gave people the opportunity to reflect on their daily lives and their experience. And we like the notion of our existence is our experience is resistance, because conditions in the mining affected communities are so bad in terms of a lack of access to clean water, to clean air, to land that people can grow crops on, and the experience of dispossession that Dineo has written about very, very powerfully in her new book, her forthcoming book, that it's a struggle to survive. For the poor and the powerless, it's a struggle on a day-to-day basis. So in a sense, their day-to-day survival is challenging the neoliberal capitalism and the power, particularly of the mineral energy complex and the elite of mining bosses. And this empowerment, we argue that this method of research is empowering in the sense that it often, we saw, enabled people to reflect that what they experienced as individual problems were actually social problems, social in the sense of their causes and consequences. It also gave people confidence, because in the second half of the day, we, the three of us, that's Dineo, Victor, and me, talked about, we gave them empirical information about environmental justice, about why the coal mines had to close, even though it's generating extreme anxieties among people, not only the coal workers, but also the women who depend on the coal workers to provide a market for people engaged in informal sector activities. And we argue that it was empowering because it gave them the confidence, this information, which we spent the second half of the day engaged in, that this information gave them confidence to argue, to make demands on local community structures, and to promote a very important aspect of ecofeminism, which is a solidarity. And it's a classic of sociology, the idea that problems are social and require organization. And it's also an important way of breaking with the neoliberal narrative, which promotes an individualism, competition rather than cooperation, for example. Now, what we were trying to do was to combine two kinds of knowledge. And the first was the experiential knowledge of communities living in mining affected structures and communities. And also we were trying to share empirical knowledge about what was happening in environmental justice mobilization, many new organizations, as Dineo has mentioned. And the importance of this empowerment was the way it generates an ecofeminism in people's practices. And that's something that Dineo referred to. And ecofeminism really has got three foci in a sense. And the first is the idea of change, but radical change, transformative change. In other words, reclaiming the notion of a just transition as a revolutionary step that makes up for some of the deficiencies in our 1994 so-called transformation to democracy, which has provided a lot of discontent and failures. And the second aspect of ecofeminism is it's promoting solidarity, because, as Dineo mentioned, many of the women are working together, and in collecting water, in collecting firewood, in trying to grow food, in providing all the tasks of social reproduction. So ecofeminism is providing a new understanding of nature also, because under neoliberal capitalism, nature is seen as a resource to be exploited for profit or a sink for our waste products, whereas the ecofeminist understanding is of a much more, with the notion that we are all part of an ecological community. Everything is connected, and nature is to be not understood as one part of a division between the natural and the social, but as an integrated notion that we are all part of nature in the food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe. So this is a revolutionary step, and I think that the environmental justice struggle, and particularly the climate justice struggle, will fail so long as we understand nature and society as two discrete and separate entities. It needs this recognition of a connection between all forms of life if we are really to mobilize the kind of strength and opposition that we need for survival. So, as Dineo said, we don't describe these people as ecofeminists because that would be imposing labels on them, but we understand the work they're doing as promoting a solidarity among women, which is the very important insight that feminism claims. But feminism has gone badly wrong in lots of ways because it has tended to focus on individual advancement, again, part of neoliberalism, rather than collective empowerment. And so we need to recognize that class and race and gender do not involve equivalent forms of oppression, which is what the postmodernists claim, because oppression and disposition always has a class content. It's always got a class relevance. And that's what we were trying to emphasize in showing how the climate crisis is creating a lot of rich people. The gap between the rich and the poor is widening. Green hydrogen is a good example of how that is promoting inequality. And instead, we have to talk about connecting women rather than the conventional pattern of white women or rich women, would be more accurate, exploiting other women in placing the burden of domestic work on them through the commoditization and employment of so-called domestic workers. So I think there are lots of positive things happening in South Africa at the moment. And people are tending, well, there's the white flight to the Western Cape, and there's a tendency to promote a feeling of hopelessness and despondency and depression about the future. But there are also new forms of organization and resistance emerging. And we like to think that you might find this chapter in the forthcoming book and in Dineo's book, which is an absolutely stunning exposure of the way ancestral graves are being exploited and commoditized. We hope that you will find it interesting and maybe even inspiring. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jackie. That's so wonderful to hear that there's something that can give us a bit of hope. As you say, there's, sometimes it's difficult when you see that even the terminology that gets used in resistance gets co-opted and robbed of its content, as you were saying in the beginning. It's really wonderful to have you here speaking, Jackie, with the experience and with the many years of experience that you've had in the environmental justice movement, and have that perspective of being able to see how things are changing. So it's wonderful to hear that you see positive things, and that you are able to recognize and I would say empower these different forms of resistance through the way your institute is doing its research. Really wonderful. I'm sure there are many questions or comments from those who are in the room. If anybody would like to make a comment or a question to Dineo or Jacklyn.
Well, maybe something I'd like to say while people are thinking is there's a very, very powerful article by Patrick Bond in the latest debate list about the struggle in Tendeli specifically, and the way it is totally disregarding people's needs and interests in order to make profit. And the profits are large, and as I said, increasing. So this is all very, very relevant.
Sorry, I should have mentioned that if you would like to speak, please, can you use the button to raise your hand, and then we can give you the microphone. Otherwise, you're welcome to write it in the chat as well. I think Patrick is on the call, actually. So,
could I ask Dineo to say a bit more about what's happening with graves and the way that's the disposition is linked to that, and what she's found from her research? Because she didn't talk about that much in her presentation, and it's very, very powerful, and I think very, very shocking.
Yeah, that would be wonderful, Dineo. If you could share some of that connections with us, that would be great.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I didn't say much about it because, I mean, obviously we are speaking to the chapter that's upcoming with Vets Press, which is on COVID-19 as well as the climate crisis and, and women in Somkhele as well as the Mpumalanga province. But I think, I mean, these struggles in some ways are very, I think, intertwined. I think we've thought about them historically as separate, but they're actually really connected. And also in that you cannot speak really about land-related matters without touching a little bit about, in fact, not a little bit, extensively about food struggles, land-based livelihoods. And I'm glad to see on the list that we've got Brittany as well, who's with us at SWAP. But also you can't speak about I think that's what I'm trying to do in my current work, to show how when you think about dispossession in South Africa, we've thought about dispossession really in relation to apartheid and colonial Africa or South Africa, but not necessarily about how dispossession continue to take place in the current political climate, right? And also how dispossession has been thought about. If you look at, literature back then, it was really conceptualized only in relation to the land. but not necessarily conceptualized around the uses of the land. So what happens on the land? And I think what my work is showing is that there's other kinds of land uses, such as burials and so on, which when you take away the land, when you dispossess or displace communities, or let's say when a community lose the land because of climate change or in the current climate crisis, the community then also lose a place to bury or connect with their ancestors. So the land is much more deeper than just it being a material thing. And I think understanding it as a material thing in some ways reflects, your neoliberal thinking, and just seeing it as something that you can buy and sell, move, transfer. And we see this in Tendele, for instance, in it wanting to mine and saying we want to relocate communities in Opondweni. And we've seen political killings of women, particularly Mam Figile Njangase and others, and it's happening elsewhere, right? And so this is happening because for mining companies or for extractives or even mining corporates, the land really is in a storage only. But it's not really thought about how, people have spiritual connections to the land. People generate food from the land. They heal from the land as well. Also, they create generational wealth from the land. And Sonkele is so interesting because there was one other area in Fuleni where the women organized specifically to challenge a mine that wanted to come mine in the area. And the argument was that we've seen what Tendele mine has done, and so we will not allow the mine. And so what was interesting is that they frame their resistance in that they can live off the land, and so they don't need the jobs at Tendele, which was quite interesting because they are thinking differently about land uses. But again, I think in our chapter, and Jackie also actually shows in her work how in Mpumalanga, in other communities, they think about mining or extractivism differently. They can't imagine alternatives because they're preoccupied with their year of jobs. And so it's quite interesting when you sort of shift in between communities and how you don't really always find the same kinds of things. In Mpumalanga, the work that Jackie has done in Victor illustrated how women, for instance, there's quite a lot of informal activities taking place around the coal mining sector, women selling fed cakes, them renting back rooms, them sewing clothes and selling these or uniform to mine workers. And so there's quite a lot of activities that are happening, and women really at the center selling, for instance, imiti, like medicine, traditional medicine to mine workers and so on, which we've also seen in the platinum industry. And so then Jackie in her work, she puts it nicely when she says that it creates sort of material dependency on coal. And then communities sometimes then struggle to see alternatives. But this is happening differently elsewhere, particularly on land where people sometimes have different connections to the land and therefore can see the alternatives and are therefore able to join or formulate organizations which then challenge extractivism. So I'll stop here.
That's fascinating, Dineo. Thank you so much. I mean, even just what you were saying, maybe go ahead, Jackie, and I'll say something after you.
Sorry, Dineo, I just need to ask you one more thing because it's so powerful in the paper and chapter and in your book. The extent of actual physical violence, not just the slow violence that you quote Nixon on, but the violence that, like Mafakile experienced, the violence of the people in Kolobeni. I think that's also very pertinent. So could you just say a little bit about the violence that we've seen?
So yes, I mean we've seen this, and what's interesting is that it's not just in the coal mining sector; it's also happening elsewhere. But I think because of the crisis that South Africa faces, energy crisis, I think it's now coming across much more strongly in coal-affected communities, and women really have been violated in different ways, be it killing, being threatened, and some, in fact, I have a few women that I know who've actually had to stop or exit the organizations they've started or were part of, were working for women, and now they're no longer part of it. And when they exit, it's really because of the threats that have been posed by mining companies. And then when they exit, they're actually sort of looked a bit with disdain in their communities because they are seen as traitors. It's like you've abandoned the struggle, you probably got money from the mine, when that's not the reality. Women are thinking about their social responsibilities that we speak about in this paper that I co-authored with Jackie, on care work, on being parents, being mothers. What does it mean, to die for the land, to die because of mining when you've got your children who are still at school and that. So we see that there's quite a lot of resistance building in communities, but there's also a bit of abandoning of the struggle because of the role that women have to play in the struggle, but also in their homes. But there is quite a lot of that. I think it heightened during COVID because most people, and we also touch on this, didn't have access. Basically, the solidarity was threatened to some degree because of the lockdown. And so then during that time, mining companies just, saw an opportunity to violate women even more. In Somkele, there was a threat that time to actually relocate about 24 families from Epondweni. And so then, there was resistance at that time, but quite a lot of threatening of activists. Women also activists, because they are at the center, they are more affected by issues of social reproductivity and care work. And so they actually are leading to a larger extent the struggle against extractivism.
Thank you so much,
Dineo. I think you're absolutely right, Dineo, but I think it's important also to, as you said, it's spreading. And Abaklali has lost something like 29 members of their leadership. So you see, the struggle for coal is a struggle for profit for the bosses. And so it is definitely going to spread and deepen. But I wanted to quote to people a comment which we got from someone in an exchange workshops in Somkele. And the comment was, with money, you can do nothing. With land, you can do everything. And there's that deep attachment to the land in the people of Kolobeni as well. But Stacey, can I wait? Should I answer Patrick's question now or wait a bit?
That's fine. It's a bit of a change of topic, but it's also a fascinating topic. So yeah. For those of you who haven't seen it there in the chat, Patrick was, maybe I'll read it briefly. My query is whether there is anything in the JP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, that can be salvaged. For example, the principle that the excess polluters of the global north pay those movements, like those in Somkele, fighting to leave coal in the hole, etc., to maintain their struggle. Would the speakers, Jackie and Dineo, would you endorse this mode of reparation payment? Interesting, based on the comment that Jacklyn has just made, besides the difference between reparation and land, in addition to the kind of emergency payments that are required in climate crisis zones. As an example, he gives the Durban Hilly townships from April 12, 2022. In addition to adaptation costs, better climate resilient infrastructure, irrigation systems, storm water drainage, etc., is one of the prerequisites of our position that anti-mining activists become even more explicitly committed to climate justice. And then he thanked the presenters. So I don't know if you want to respond to that, Jackie or Dineo.
Well, in terms of Patrick's question, there's a very interesting paper, Patrick, which I'm sure you've seen, by the Institute for Economic Justice, in which they talk about the fragility of this just energy transition investment project. Because although it's a great deal of money, there's talk of 15 trillion rand, which is just impossible to imagine. They say that is threatened by all the talk about reopening and rebuilding coal mines and coal-fired power stations. They also say, and this is a very important point, that there is insufficient attention being paid to alternatives for the coal miners and coal people working in coal plants who are going to lose their jobs. And lately I've been at two seminars where people were almost in tears. And one comment was, this just transition is killing us, meaning it's going to take away our jobs. And another comment was, how are we going to feed our children? And of course, with the disaster in KwaZulu-Natal over the school feeding scheme, these are very, very real threats. And because the just transition narrative has been captured by elites, indifferent and greedy and complacent elites who do not seem to be shocked by what is happening in South Africa in terms of children drowning in bucket toilets and not being fed through corruption in the school feeding schemes. And these people are not providing, they're controlling the process. And they're talking about the profits to be made in green hydrogen, and they are not giving enough attention to people who are going to lose their jobs by the closure of the coal mines and power stations, which does need to happen. And they are also not paying, well, they're paying lip service to the idea of community participation. But I went to a seminar on green hydrogen recently, which went on for 2 hours. And the person presenting talked about, we are concerned with job creation and with community participation. That was the only time in the 2 hours that he mentioned the question of jobs or community participation. And so Mark Swilling made a very interesting comment in the seminar. He said, green hydrogen must be the subject of a very sophisticated public relations exercise. So I think people that we are being lied to, we are being, yeah, it's a dreadful situation. And so certainly in terms of community participation, in terms of a democratic just transition, we are losing badly. But I think that Barbara Creasy is being attacked for her allowing a project near Grahamstown, which is going to involve mass destruction of wild animals by a group from the Middle East. And I think that now's the time to exert pressure on her, because the car power ship strategy depends on environmental authorization. And the Department of Environment has been reluctant to provide that. So I think I can't think of new political strategies, but I do think that it's a very, very important moment in which to mobilize, and where there's a lot of false claims being made about the financing of a just energy transition, because it's using that narrow definition of change, which could blind us all into thinking load shedding will end tomorrow.
Yeah, so there Jackie is also responding to the question of Shirley regarding strategies against car power ships that we can support now. But yeah, I mean, the question there of Patrick regarding the JP, I think very interesting that the exchanges that you have provoked by your research is exactly the seedbed of alternative thinking, and could potentially, I mean, I don't know if what Dineo was saying about the different communities, and that in some communities they've managed to see beyond that material dependency of coal. If that kind of exchange could go from community to community, that there can be this sense of that there's a different way of doing things, the sense of radical change, like you were talking about in terms of your definition of ecofeminism, rather than a shallow change. Like the idea, as Jackie, as you're saying, that there's some sort of a quick solution, that we're going to be able to quickly fix the load shedding problem with a technocratic,
which is nonsense. Yeah.
Also, Charles was commenting regarding how NGOs have been at the forefront of women's struggles, while political parties, which are dominated by men, have addressed women's struggles only when it suits them. So how can South Africa develop a vibrant feminist movement that transcends political division? Indeed, in the climate justice charter movement, we are also in a space between politics and social movement that is an interesting space to navigate. I don't know if either of the speakers would like to speak about that idea. How can South Africa develop a vibrant feminist movement that transcends the political divisions that kind of slow us down, I guess?
Well, I think it's got to be driven from below, because I think that many middle-class women who might even call themselves feminists are still mainly concerned with individual advancement. And, you know, we are two completely disconnected societies with growing poverty and growing inequality. And I think that the danger of much feminist thinking is its individualism and a materialism, an emphasis on extravagant consumption and display, rather than a concern for the poor and the powerless who are suffering the brunt of all of this and who are not being considered in all the fancy, flawed programs for getting finance from the global north.
Yeah, so just Shirley, I see that you have your hand up, but just since this is the same idea, Patrick has then also responded regarding that. Like, would it be at least, is there a possibility to at least salvage that intention of getting funding from the global north for the actual movements that are trying to do that, to prevent coal from coming out of the ground? So Shirley, I think you can go ahead.
I think with regards to JPs and the question that Professor Bond has asked, I think that it is worth pursuing that kind of a model. And I see, like, we have to some degree say that those who contribute the most to pollution have to pay for it. But also because in that process, they have dispossessed communities. And so I do think they have to pay for it. The only, I think, thing that personally I struggle with, particularly when I work with communities, is how much do you, and this is a very important question that has also entered South African courts, which is how much do you compensate for the loss, right? Some of it which is tangible and some of it which is intangible, because some of the violence is also intangible, you can't see, right? So then how much do we compensate communities in that regard? But I think nonetheless, even though we haven't really figured an answer to that question, I do think we should pursue that kind of model of the mode of reparations and payment model. So I do think it has to be explored. But I think, he also posed a question about whether now mining activists have to, one of the requirements is to be explicit about your activism. I think it's the context within which communities find themselves that forces them to actually be explicit about their role and responsibility in fighting extractivism, because on a daily they don't have water, but there's a mining company that has water. They don't have electricity. And women can't cook. It's quite difficult. Air pollution. People have all kinds, including children, have got all kinds of diseases. And also children being born deformed because of that constant, encounter with pollution and so on. And so all these conditions are compelling people to actually enter the struggle, whether they want it or not, because it's their daily lived experience. But I think at the same time, it's putting a threat to their lives, I must say. I mean, we've seen, the killing and Mamfikile Nchangas's killing, they haven't done anything about it yet. And she's not the only one. It's just that it happened at the time when there was COVID and it was quiet. And so it was on every television station. But it's happening across communities on extracted land. But more and more, it's putting people's lives at risk, especially women. Particularly on tribal land, which tribal land has got its own set of politics where traditional authorities can, put surveillance. Specifically, in fact, women have spoken about this to say traditional leaders know who are the troublesome people in the villages and so on. And so, there is a list, and there's also hit lists and all kinds of things on women, but also men as well. But because the struggle is mostly organized by women, then their lives are really at risk. So I hope that answers Prof's question.
It does. Thank you so much, Dineo. I think
Stacey,
yes, go ahead.
I wonder if we could ask Patrick to say more about reparations and Cabo Delgado. He said that's a good example.
That would be interesting. I just want to give Shirley a chance. She's been waiting. But go ahead, Shirley, and then we can open up the floor to Patrick.
Thanks very much. I'm at the point where I think the most important place to build any kind of feminist movement is in solidarity with the women we've been talking about now, those fighting extractives. Because I think that we are in such dire states, sort of state as a country and as a world, that we have to work in solidarity with the women who are on the front lines. So how we do it, I'm not sure, but certainly joining forces with the various organizations that are engaged in this work, I think is the most important thing we need to do, because as we're hearing, the lives of these women who are actually fighting our fight are so extreme that they need all the help they can get. So if anyone has ideas for how we can do this most effectively, I think that's where I would certainly want to put my energies. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley. Thanks. Patrick, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I don't know if the video works, but in any event, the main question, and perhaps it relates to Jackie's challenge for expanding our concepts of reparations, is the way I think feminists, particularly in relation to the social reproduction and the future generations, have a unique way to approach the intergenerational debt. So we can always speak of class debt. I have a high carbon footprint, so I have a high climate debt to the people of Somkele who work so hard to keep the coal in the hole. And likewise I must say, to lots of activists in Mozambique, yes, the most effective appear to be Islamic guerrillas who've kept Total Energies at bay, even fighting the South African National Defence Force lads. It's such a tragedy, isn't it, that we send our boys there, black young men, to die on behalf of a Parisian corporate, a very corrupt company, Total Energies, white-owned, on behalf of extraction of gas from the third largest field in the world, what Jackie was referring to in Cabo Delgado. So I hope anti-war feminists, and Jackie's really the most famous, can continue to raise the question of whether our boys are sub-imperialist tools of French imperialism, fossil imperialism. But in addition, do you think that ecofeminism should more actively promote the rights of future generations, specifically to leave fossil fuels underground? And the obvious reason is women's stewardship compared to we men, who are just not nearly as, let's say, forward-thinking and concerned with social reproduction. So we can have geographical and class climate debt, but I think there's a generational climate debt that Ariel Saleh often reminds us of. And then secondly, if we do so, if we think about future generations, it may be that they would have a basis for extracting the Somkele coal in the future in a non-invasive way, so that the lubricants of hydrocarbons pharmaceutical products, maybe necessary synthetic materials, maybe tarmac, all the kind of stress, not combustion, not burning the hydrocarbons and creating climate crisis. And I'm just wondering if ecofeminists are doing this quite interesting rights of future generations work, not only to say the climate catastrophe should not be something that we give our future generations, but also that they may need the hydrocarbons from fossil fuels, not for combustion, they're smarter than us. And we have an obligation to leave them underground for that reason. And the reason this is so critical is because South Africa is so desperate to export coal. Botswana has 220 billion tons. We have about 43 billion. I've just been in Zimbabwe. The coal up there is another.
Patrick, you know what worries me about future generations?
So keeping coal in the hole.
It's a key concept in climate justice struggles everywhere. But my impression is that conditions are so bad in South Africa that a lot of people, their energies are concerned with immediate issues. I mean, you know, the immediate issue, I think, for many people is what's happening in Hammanskraal and the very real threat of a cholera epidemic. And the water that's been shown on television that comes out of taps is brown and smelly. And so I think there's a real need to address, maybe simultaneously, to get, you know, for people to think about the present and particularly material needs and conditions as well. And while I'm talking, can I just address Kizito's question about link between the two economies, because it's a very important point, which I tried to make, but it's not strongly enough. And that is the fact that many of the women that Dineo was describing are dependent on coal workers to provide a market for informal sector activities. They dominate the informal sector in most of these places. And that market is going to evaporate if we close the coal mines and power stations in this very insensitive way in which it's being debated now, whereby people are left without any kinds of livelihood. And by the way, the plants that are making plans, like Hendrika, tend to focus on the Eskom workers and not the majority of the workforce who are contract workers. So they are going to be left high and dry if things continue with the present insensitivity and indifference to the needs of the poor.
I hope that responded to the question of Kizito. If you'd like to say anything, Kizito, just you can raise your hand. Patrick, do you have another point that you'd like to make? Or is your hand up from earlier?
Yeah, that was my hand being residual. But just to continue to debate with dear comrade Jackie and Dineo, I mean, the Somkhele case, particularly with Fikile and Chingazi, is a really interesting challenge. It's about the narratives. And having worked a little bit in and around that scene, it is tricky, isn't it? What Jackie just said is very real, that the, let's say, micro imperatives and the local attention and the potential that it would be, you know, NGOs or lawyers, in this case, extremely good ones. I mean, I have the highest regard for the kinds of progressive conservationism that the women like Sheila Berry or the legal group All Rise, led by Kirsten Ewens, have demonstrated. No complaints. But nevertheless, I do think there could be much more mileage. And one very quick example is that in Ohio, most of the profits from Tsindele, right, the coal company that was super exploiting the hell, literally, out of Somkhele, have been disappearing. And they're there, run by a guy called Bradley Doig, to set up a pig iron facility. And it just strikes me as such a great opportunity for climate justice to reach across the ocean, to find solidaristic relationships so that we can put pressure on, you know, this company called Petmin, the holding company, which has a headquarters, by the way, in Sandton. We should be protesting at more regularly, to give the damn money back, to pay the reparations. And when that was raised in the courts, a couple of weeks after the assassination of Fikile Ncingasi, it also applied to the World Bank. And I do think that would be that internationalist opportunity for ecofeminism of the sort that Dineo has been tapping into on water struggles, because, you know, women and water are so critical, but also for climate justice. And I just wish we'd see a little bit more expansive thinking in solidarity, so that our comrades in Ohio, of whom there are a few, would be getting a more persistent message to do something to stop the looting of some Kele profits from coal that killed Fikile and Njingasi, that went to some Kele. To Ohio. I just add one other one. The NGOs, some of them have been atrocious, and I have to single out WESA, Wildlife and Environment Society, because they encouraged Tendele not to dig for coal close to Mfolozi, the oldest game park in Africa, 1895, but instead to move in the opposite direction, which they labeled laudable. They thought it was laudable that Tendele move towards Fikile and Njingasi's house, which led to her assassination. That kind of reparations by groups like, well, let's just say by WESA, that's long overdue. And I hope activists can call out, let me call them fortress conservation NGOs. Sorry to rail a little bit on that.
So I don't know if you want to respond directly to that, Jacklyn. I also have another question that is maybe a little bit related. You know, we've been talking now about this different solidarity of women's movements and environmental justice movements, maybe across geographical and class boundaries. But I wonder if there's some way in which, for example, the point raised by Shirley, like to support these activists and women who don't even identify as activists in their anxiety, that their lives are being threatened by their resistance. You know, is it a case of simply exposing what is going on? Is it a case? How can these women feel more protected by all of this seeming community of people who want to act in solidarity with them? I don't know if it's fair for such a community to be indifferent to their anxiety and rather just pushing them to resist more and more when they feel, for example, like Dineo was saying, that they need to pull out because they have to survive to look after their own children, you know?
Look, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because it's part of, you know, we're a very fractured society. And the truth is that many, not just the elite, not just the very rich have got generators, and many of them have got boreholes. So they're totally immune to the climate crisis in terms of their daily personal lives. So notions of support can easily become paternalist, maternalist, I suppose is a better word. And also I'm skeptical about Patrick's emphasis on reparations, because, you know, one of the dominant trends today, as I understand it, is the way nature is being commodified and seen as a source of, and a real source of increasing profits, e.g. green hydrogen. But I think more important is the ethic of care that Dineo and Victor and I have seen in these desperately poor communities. There's a sharing, there's an emphasis on living simply, and there's an emphasis on solidarity, supporting each other. And that ethic doesn't seem to me to exist very much in the rest of South Africa, apart from organizations like Gift of the Givers, who come in to help in a crisis situation. So I think there has to be a fundamental sort of shift. And perhaps if we are thinking of support, then, you know, maybe it might sound feeble, but maybe having protest actions like the Black Sash used to do about the abuses of apartheid, with silent placards holding stands in key places, to shift the kind of brutalization that's happening in South Africa, that people are indifferent to other people's suffering. But I'm also worried about, there was a question about car power ships and new strategies. I'm waiting to see the the Center for Environmental Rights or Groundwork or Earth Life come out with some strategy, because this is definitely what we need, because it's such a critical moment. And I think everyone is so upset by, well, not everyone, but the majority of people are so desperate to end load shedding that they might buy anything, even though it's going to be a disaster for marine life all around our coast, because the car power ships have now got permission to dock in 3 different ports. So I think we need more occasions like this to be talking, because I think a lot of us do feel anger and indignation, and it's hard to come up with the concrete actions which unify, and which don't just look back to the past in a nostalgic sort of way. And it's also difficult to avoid a talk about extermination, which is what we are faced with, and not just, of a few, wildlife species, but of all forms of life. And many scientists are saying that the clock is ticking, and it's now 2 minutes to midnight, and midnight being the point at which that extermination happens. So, yeah, I think we just need to be talking and thinking more than we do, because I think that's one of the serious remnants of COVID, Dineo. We haven't had a chance to talk about this, but I think it's led to a privatization of people's social lives. People have retreated into private worlds, or if they can afford it, to the white flight to the Western Cape, and to lead, sybaritic sort of very indulgent lives in a beautiful place. So we've got a lot to do, many challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, just to add on to that, I mean, so in our exchange workshops, we discovered that a lot of communities know what climate change is, to a point when we were trying to come up with like vernacular articulations of climate change. For some, it wasn't too difficult. But having said that, there's quite a lot of people who don't know or who are ignorant of what climate change is. So I think probably one other way, as Jackie's saying, of sort of building solidarity is really centering the climate agenda. And I mean, like literally in schools, and going up to university level, because we're not even talking enough at university level. And so how do you get a buy-in for people to understand what we're dealing with? Because this is a crisis that affects people of all races, people of all classes, but of course differently. And that's what our paper shows. But it affects everyone. And for that reason, then that struggle should cut across your political nation, your religious belief, and so on, because it's a struggle that we all going to experience. We all experience, horrible lightning, floods, and so on, irrespective of our class and race. But of course, the impacts of that we, experience much more differently. So I think maybe much more, as Jackie's saying, talk, much more education, much more exchanges beyond our institutions and, our hierarchies as well. I think it's needed. And as Patrick was talking about reparations, I mean, I support the idea of reparations, but at the same time, Patrick wrote an article that's disclosing how broke Tendele is, which then sort of, it really makes the whole thing gloomy, because you're thinking, how will they pay them? But I mean, irrespective of that, I think it's something I think I'd say we should push forward. And on the last point that Patrick had made about ecofeminism and thinking through the future, this is just a comment, but I've been struck, Jackie, in our research about how the women we're talking about are not practicing ecofeminism simply because there's a climate crisis. I mean, when you speak to them, it seems like this has some historical roots. And I'll give you an example, and I think Brittany could attest to this. Because, for instance, when they speak about how they dig herbs or traditional medicine, they speak about how they've always done it in a way that doesn't cut the root completely, so you can always use it for generations, right? Because if maybe you cut it in a particular way, then you can't use that same herb or whatever root that people would use to cure arthritis and so on. And so it shows in their thinking that there's always been some thinking about the environment and sustainability and the protection of the environment. So I thought it's very interesting when Patrick was talking about ecofeminism and futuristic thinking, in that it's amazing how this is not a concept that just really, I think, emerges now, but it seems, as we're showing in our paper, that this is something they've always done, which is to think differently about nature and how you ought to leave the environment for other generations beyond yourself.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. Yeah, yeah. There is a strong tradition, indigenous African environmentalism, which is respectful, which is rejects any forms of waste and extravagance, and we need to draw on that. But could I maybe just put a question, but it's very much in terms of my own view, which I wouldn't want to impose on Dineo. But I believe that we are looking to the cause of the problem to provide solutions when we talk about capitalism. I think the future needs, Patrick, much more feminist energy directed into an African eco-feminist socialism. And I think that's the only viable future. And we have to break the associations, the stigma and fear that's associated with the Soviet Union, and promote a new way of living, that it promotes cooperation and sharing and living simply, but caring for other people. And we are losing that in South Africa.
Yeah, fascinating how these issues of a care ethic, with the whole idea that has come up a couple of times of survival. That's many of these practices are ancient practices that are around sustaining life. Sustainability is around that, really. I don't know if Brittany, you wanted to come in. If you would like to say anything, you can just raise your hand. But otherwise, if there's anybody else with some questions, and maybe if not, we can start with some closing comments, and let's just see if Brittany wants to speak.
I can see a hand, but I can't see a face. Yeah.
You can see a hand. Let me see if I can see it. Oh, no, I can't. I don't know why. Charles, are you able to see that somebody's wanting to speak? I don't see a hand, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Sorry, it might be the view. Maybe let me try and change to a different view, or no, I don't see any hands there. I don't know if Charles, if you wanted to come in at all based on what you've been writing in terms of the right of nature policy regarding this idea of indigenous knowledge. But otherwise, maybe if Brittany says she's happy to, she doesn't need the mic. Otherwise, if Charles, if you would like to say something, please go ahead. Otherwise, I think we can start closing.
No, thank you, Stacey. You can close. Thank you.
All right, great. So yeah, Jackie, Dineo, if you'd like to make some closing comments, that would be wonderful.
Forward to socialism, and eco-feminist socialism.
Good, Dineo. Anything from your side?
No, nothing from my side. But thank you so much for giving us this platform.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
it's always so brilliant to have these discussions, and I thank you so much, both of you especially, for being here, and to all of those who participated. Really for a very interesting, robust discussion. I hope that those who see the recording are able to pick up some of the comments on the side. I'm not sure how that works. At least we made an attempt to reference most of them. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And yeah, look forward to some more discussions like this in the future. Thank you for all the good food for thought.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Bye.